Now let's talk about simple interest. Interest is the amount of money we get paid for lending or investing money, or that we get charged for borrowing money. Principal is the amount of money we deposit or borrow. The rate is given as a percent in the problem and determines the amount of interest. And simple interest is interest that's calculated only on the principal. If we look at the simple interest formula, it's I equals P R T, where I is the interest, and that's measured in dollars. Principal is what P stands for and is also measured in money or dollars. R is the rate and it's as a decimal. Remember, it'll be given as a percent in the problem. And time is what T represents, and it has to be measured in years. If we look at number 1, it says you deposit $2,000 in a savings account at Hometown Bank, which has a rate of 5%. Find the interest at the end of 4 years. So I have the formula I equals PRT. It's the only simple interest formula we know so far. Whenever I'm starting with a formula, I'm going to write out I equals, P equals, R equals, and T equals, or whatever variables are in the problem, and break them down. Now I'm going to look through the problem again and fill in that right-hand side where I have all my variables with the information I know. So they told me that I deposit $2,000. So that's my principal because the amount that I deposit or borrow is principal in a savings account at Hometown Bank, which has a rate of 5%. So I know the rate in percent form is 5%, but I know I need that in decimal form. So I'm going to take my percent, that 5, and divide it by 100. That gives me an answer of 0.05. So that's the rate in decimal form and what I'll use in my equation. They tell me find the interest, so I don't know my interest at the end of 4 years. So the time is 4 years. The units for time needed to be years, so I'm good. Now I'm going to actually substitute the numbers in. So I don't know the interest. It equals the principal, 2,000, times the rate, 0.05, times the time, the 4 years. Now I'm going to plug that in my calculator. So I have 2,000 times 0.05 times 4. That gives me 400. Now I know interest was in dollars, so the interest earned would be $400. One thing I want to point out is notice I wrote out the equation by hand before I plugged it into the calculator. I'm expecting come test time that you do the same thing, and it's for 2 reasons. First, it'll let me give you partial credit if you hit a button weird in the calculator, because I'll see what you have written out. Second, it'll help you make sure you're using the right equation, and it'll help you make sure that you're substituting the right numbers into the right place. Let's look at number 2. They ask us to find the simple interest for $3,500 borrowed at a 2.6% rate for 7 months. So they're talking about simple interest again, and I only know one simple interest formula, I equals P R T. So I'm going to start out the same way I started before. Now, if I read through the problem, they're telling me to find the simple interest. So I don't know the interest again. For $3,500, so that's the principal because it's how much I borrowed, at a 2.6% rate. So the rate is 2.6%, or if I turn that into a decimal, 0.026 for 7 months. So they give me the time, but they give it to me in the wrong units. It's in months, and I need it to be in years. So I'm going to use dimensional analysis like we learned back in Unit 1. So I have 7 months over 1, and I need to multiply to cancel the months out and get to years. And I know there's 12 months in 1 year. So the months and months cancel out, and I find that 7 months is the same thing as 7/12ths of a year. So the time that I'm going to actually substitute into this equation is 7/12ths of a year. One thing I want to point out is when I do 7 divided by 12 in my calculator, I get this repeating decimal, the 0.583 repeating. And I don't want to have any rounding when I'm substituting in. So I'm going to actually substitute in the fraction, not a rounded decimal. Now I'm going to substitute in, like I've been saying I will. So I have interest equals the principal, 3,500, times the rate in decimal form, 0.026, times the time in years, 7/12ths. Then I'm going to plug this into my calculator. So I have 3,500 times 0.026 times, and for 7/12ths, I'm going to do 7 divided by 12, because remember, a fraction bar and a division sign are the same thing. So for interest, the I, we have 53.083 repeating. Now, remember, interest was in money. So when we have this decimal answer, they can ask us to round to one of two places. They can either ask us to round to the nearest cent, or they can ask us to round to the nearest dollar. Your homework will sometimes ask for one and sometimes ask for the other, so make sure you're double checking what the specific problem you're working on asks for. So if they ask us to round to the nearest cent, they're really asking us to round to the nearest hundredths place, 2 digits after the decimal point. So that 3 is telling us to leave that 8 alone. So if I was asked to round to the nearest cent, my answer would be $53.08. If I was asked to round to the nearest dollar, it really means I'm rounding to the nearest whole number. So that 0 tells me to leave that 3 alone, and my answer rounded to the nearest dollar is $53. Let's look at another example. They tell us you deposit $1,500 and earn $35 simple interest over 2 years. Find the rate. So they're talking about simple interest. I only know one simple interest formula. The I equals PRT. I'll list out all the variables. If I read through the problem, they told me I deposit $1,500, so that's my principal, and earn $35 simple interest. So this time they're giving me the simple interest over 2 years. So the time is 2 years. It's in the units I want, years, so I don't have to do any conversions. Find the rate. So I don't know the rate. I'm going to substitute in everything I know. So the interest was $35 equals the principal, $1,500, times the rate, we don't know it, so I'll leave it R, times the time, the 2 years. Now notice on this right-hand side we have multiplication. So what I'm going to do is multiply 1,500 times 2, because I know the order doesn't matter for multiplication. So if I do 1,500 times 2, I get 3,000 times R. I can't forget about that R. But when we're multiplying just one number and a variable, we normally just write them together, so the 3,000R. So I now have 35 equals 3,000R. I'm going to solve for that R. To undo multiplication, I use division. So I'm going to divide both sides of this equation by 3,000. If I do that, I have 35 divided by 3,000, which gives me 0.0116 repeating equals R. We're not actually done the question here, or done the problem. So remember, whenever we substituted a value for R into the equation, we substituted it in decimal form. So this is our answer in decimal form. But they always gave us the rate in percent form. So if they're asking us for the rate, we need to answer in percent form as well. So remember, to go from a decimal to a percent, we need to multiply by 100. So I'm going to hit that answer button and I'm going to multiply it by 100. If we do that, we get 1.16 repeating percent. So if we needed an exact answer, that's what we would give. But they typically ask us to round percents to the nearest tenth. Remember, that's one digit after the decimal point. So that 6 tells me to bump that one up. So if I had to round to the nearest tenth, I would say it's 1.2%. Let's look at one more example. For number 4, they tell us to find the simple interest for $2,380 borrowed at 3/4% for 150 days. Assume there are 360 days in a year. So they're asking about simple interest. We only know one simple interest formula, I equals PRT. And I'll list out all my variables. If I read through again, they're telling me to find the simple interest, so I don't know the interest, for $2,380 borrowed. So it's the amount I borrowed, so that's the principal, at 3.4%, or I'm sorry, 3/4%. So that's going to help me find the rate for 150 days. That's going to help me find the time. So let's focus in on the rate first. That rate is 3/4%. And we know that once we substitute rate into the equation, we need it to be in decimal form. So I need to get this percent into decimal form. Normally, we just divide by 100, but I have a fraction. So what I'm going to do first is turn the fraction into a decimal. So I'm going to do 3 divided by 4, which gives me 0.75. Now I'm only turning that fraction into a decimal. So I have 0.75, but it's still a percent. I haven't done anything to get rid of the percent sign yet. So now I need to go from a percent to a decimal. And to do that, I divide by 100. So I'm going to take my answer and divide it by 100, which gives me 0.0075. So the rate that I'm going to substitute into the equation, because the one in decimal form, is 0.0075. One thing I want to point out, because I see it a lot, 3/4% is not 0.75, right? That 0.75 is really 75%. So be careful, because that's a mistake I see a lot. Now let's focus in on the time. So if we look at that time, it's in days. They gave us 150 days. Now they're telling us to assume that there are 360 days in a year. We know that's not actually the case, but because this is the way that you'll see it in the homework and the quiz and on the test if it's there in My Labs Plus, it's how I'm going to do the example here as well. So I'd want days to cancel out, so I'd put my 360 days in the denominator in 1 year. The days would cancel out, and we'll end up with 150 over 360 years. So the time in years, which are the units we want, is that fraction 150 over 360. Now I can substitute in. So that interest equals that principal, the 2,380, times the rate in decimal form, 0.0075, times the time in years, 150 over 360. Now that I have it all written out, I'm going to plug it in my calculator. 2,380 times 0.0075 times 150 divided by 360. And that gives us 7.4375. Like before, they could ask me to round this to the nearest cent or to the nearest dollar. If I round to the nearest cent, the 7 tells me to bump up, so I would have $7.44. They asked me to round to the nearest dollar, The 4 would tell me to leave that alone, so it would just be $7.